A war hero who spent 3 years trying to die returns to London seeking the faithless wife who betrayed him, only to find her starving in widow's black and holding a forged letter declaring him dead. As he uncovers a ruthless family conspiracy and grapples with the nightmares that still drag him back to the battlefield, Julian Sterling must decide whether he will finally surrender to death or fight to reclaim the woman and the life that was stolen from them both. If you love tales of passion and courage, please subscribe. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We'd love to know how far these stories travel. England, 1816, post-Waterloo. The gas lamps of London's East End cast a sickly, flickering haze over the sea of grime and crumbling brick tenements below. In the shadows, partially concealed by the thick fog, stood Major Lord Julian Sterling, his survival weighing heavily upon his soul as he observed the destitute building before him. "Is it truly him?" whispered the hired investigator behind his hand to his companion. "The immortal Major has returned from yet another campaign. One would think after 3 years of seeking death in every suicide charge, he might accept his survival with gratitude." The words, though spoken in hushed tones, carried to Julian's ears like the phantom whistle of a cannonball finding its mark. He stiffened his wounded leg, smoothed the lapel of his military greatcoat, a garment deemed appropriate for a hero, though he felt like a ghost, and pretended not to have heard. At 30, Julian had long since become accustomed to such reverence, which felt more like mockery. The celebrated hero of the esteemed Sterling family, he had watched as his comrades died with honour, as his peers returned to faithful wives and established households, as the country that hailed him as a saviour now regarded him with a mixture of awe and uneasy fear. But he had not returned for glory. He had returned to confront the betrayal that had sent him to war in the first place. Julian dismissed the investigator with a sharp gesture and a coin, leaving the man to vanish into the fog. He ascended the tenement stairs alone, the rotting wood groaning under his boot and the heavy, rhythmic thud of his cane. He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in the blood-soaked trenches of Spain and the mud of Waterloo. He would find her draped in silk, perhaps laughing with the wealthy merchant she had chosen over a soldier's uncertain future. He would cast his scarred shadow over their illicit joy and watch it wither. He wanted her to see the ruin she had made of him before he turned his back on her, forever. He reached the top landing, his breath misting in the freezing air. With a hand that had held steady while aiming at French officers but now trembled with rage, he pushed the door open. It swung inward on rusted hinges, banging softly against the wall, but there was no silk, no laughter, no warmth. The room was a garret, stark and freezing, save for a narrow cot and a dying fire in the grate that offered more smoke than heat. A figure stood by the lone window, scrubbing a garment in a basin of grey water. She turned at the intrusion, her movement weary and slow, as if the very air pressed down upon her. Julian felt his breath hitch in his throat, a physical pain sharper than shrapnel. Her golden hair was dull, pulled back severely, and her face was gaunt, the cheekbones sharp enough to cut. But it was her dress that stopped his heart cold. A ragged, shapeless thing of coarse wool, dyed the deepest, uncompromising black. "Evelyn," he rasped, the name tasting like ash and iron in his mouth. The woman froze. The garment slipped from her wet, red-raw hands, splashing into the basin. She turned fully, her eyes widening, vast and terrified in her pale face. She did not scream. She did not recoil in the guilt of an adulteress caught in her sin. She simply raised a trembling hand to her mouth, looking through him rather than at him. "Julian," she whispered, the sound barely a breath, fragile as glass. "My love? Have you come to take me with you then?" She took a stumbling step forward, her gaze fixed on his face with a devastating mixture of longing and horror. I knew you would come back, even from the grave," she swayed, her eyes rolling back. "I am ready," she murmured, her knees buckling. Julian moved without thinking, catching her before she hit the floor. But as he held her, his body remained rigid. The sight of her in widow's weeds stunned him, but the letter in his pocket still burned against his chest. He was a man torn between the evidence of his eyes and the evidence in his hand. She was not living in luxury. She was mourning. When Evelyn's lashes finally fluttered open, she did not scream again. Instead, she reached out, her rough, chapped fingers trembling as they traced the jagged scar that bisected his cheek, verifying his solidity against the damp air of the room. "Warm," she whispered. "You are warm." Julian pulled back sharply, standing and leaving her cold on the cot. He needed his anger. It was the only thing holding him upright. "I am alive, Evelyn," he said, his voice hard. "Do not mistake my presence for forgiveness, though not for lack of trying on your part." She pushed herself up on the cot, confusion warring with the lingering shock. She pulled her shawl tighter around her thin shoulders. "My part? Julian, I have prayed every night for your soul since the news came. I have worn black until the fabric turned to grey." "Do not lie to me!" The shout seemed to shake the fragile walls. He reached into the breast pocket of his greatcoat and withdrew the letter that had lived next to his heart, stained with sweat, rain, and dried blood. He threw it onto the cot. "You wrote that. You told me you had found a protector, a merchant with a future, unlike a second son destined for the infantry. You abandoned me to the French guns." Evelyn stared at the paper, then snatched it up. Her eyes scanned the lines, reading the cruel words of rejection he had memorized in the trenches. She shook her head violently, tears spilling over. "I never wrote this. I wrote to you every week until—" She scrambled off the cot, falling to her knees beside a small, battered trunk at the foot of the bed. With shaking hands, she produced a document sealed with ominous black wax. "Until this," she choked out, holding it up like a shield. "The letter from the colonel. They said you fell at Vittoria. They said there was no body to recover." Julian took the paper. The seal looked official, the language precise and military. But as his eyes traced the loops of the calligraphy, a cold nausea roiled in his gut. The flourish on the capital M. The specific sharp angle of the T's. He had seen this handwriting 1,000 times in his youth, drafting estate ledgers and invitations in the library of his ancestral home. "This is not from the colonel," he whispered, the horror rising like bile. "This was written by Stanton, my father's secretary." He looked from the forged death notice in his hand to the forged rejection letter on the cot. The silence that stretched between them was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a battlefield after the slaughter. His father, the Duke, had played God. He had declared Julian dead to the wife he deemed unworthy, and declared Evelyn faithless to the son he wanted to drive to destruction. They stared at one another across the small freezing room, two survivors of a war that had been fought entirely with pen and ink. Julian looked at his wife's hollow cheeks, starved for a husband she thought dead, and felt the crushing weight of every suicidal charge he had led. He had sought death to escape a pain that was a lie, while she had lived in a hell constructed by his own blood. "Gather what remains," Julian commanded, his voice rough with a fatigue that went deeper than his bones. "You cannot stay here another hour." Evelyn hesitated, her hands hovering over the meagre pile of her belongings, a cracked hairbrush, a Bible, the few coins she had earned scrubbing linens until her knuckles bled. "Julian, I cannot simply— Where would I go? I have no standing, no home. To your father?" "Never to him," Julian snarled. "To the estate in Kent." He paused, his jaw working as he calculated the risk. "The Duke is in London for the season. The house is empty and the staff are loyal to me. We will be safe there, for now." He paused, his gaze fixing on a water stain on the wall rather than her face. "Not as a wife, not yet. There is too much broken glass between us to walk across barefoot, but I will not leave you to starve in the shadow of my family's sins." She nodded, a jerky, fragile motion, and allowed him to lead her down the dark stairwell. When they emerged onto the street, his private carriage waited like a black hearse in the mist. The footman's eyes widened to see the Major escorting a woman in rags, but Julian's glare dared the man to speak. He handed Evelyn up, his gloved hand swallowing her thin, red, raw fingers. Inside, the carriage was stiflingly opulent. The plush velvet seats and polished mahogany seemed to mock the poverty Evelyn had just left. Julian sat opposite her, not beside her, creating a chasm of empty space that felt wider than the English Channel. As the wheels clattered over the cobblestones, the silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Julian turned his head toward the window, presenting his profile to the glass to hide the ruin of his face. He could feel the jagged ridge of the scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, a souvenir from a French sabre at Vittoria. He felt a monster in the dark, a scarred beast sitting across from a woman made of porcelain and grief. "She looks at me and sees a stranger," he thought bitterly. "Or worse, she sees the wreckage of the man I used to be." Across from him, Evelyn stole glances at him when the gas lamps flickered past. This man was broader, harder than the poetic youth who had courted her in secret gardens. His hands, resting on the head of his cane, were scarred and dangerous, hands that had strangled hope and ended lives. The Julian she loved had written sonnets. This man looked as though he had forgotten the very language of softness. "I am sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rattle of the wheels. "Do not," he cut her off, his voice sharp, though he did not look at her. "We are both victims of a war we did not know we were fighting. Let us just survive the night." He returned his gaze to the fog outside, leaving Evelyn to wrap her thin shawl tighter around herself, shivering not from the cold, but from the terrifying proximity of this familiar stranger. The scream shattered the stillness of the Kent countryside, a sound of such raw, primal anguish that it seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Evelyn was out of her bed before she was fully awake, her bare feet slapping against the cold oak of the corridor as she ran toward the master suite. It was not the cry of a man in pain, but the roar of a man reliving his own death. She burst through the heavy mahogany doors to find Julian thrashing in the tangle of his sheets, his body arched like a bowstring. "Incoming! Down! Stay down!" he bellowed, his voice hoarse with the phantom smoke of Salamanca. His hands clawed at the air, fighting off invisible French dragoons, his nightshirt soaked through with cold sweat. "Julian! Julian! Wake up!" Evelyn cried, rushing to the bedside. She reached out to shake his shoulder, but the moment her fingers grazed his skin, he violently recoiled, scrambling backward against the headboard until he hit the wood with a sickening thud. His eyes were wide, unseeing, wild with panic. He grasped for a pistol that wasn't there, his chest heaving. As his gaze finally focused on her, the terror didn't leave his face. It was replaced by a crushing shame that was painful to witness. He pulled the sheet up to hide his scarred chest, turning his face away into the shadows. "Get out!" he croaked, his voice trembling. "Do not look at me. I am broken." "You are my husband," Evelyn said firmly, ignoring the command. She moved to the basin, dipping a cloth in cool water, and sat on the edge of the bed. "I am a graveyard," he shouted, the anger returning as a shield. "I volunteered for the vanguard, Evelyn. I walked into cannon fire begging it to take me. I should be dead. The men who followed me, they are dead. I am just the wreckage left behind." He flinched as she reached out, expecting disgust. Instead, she gently pressed the cool cloth to his fevered brow, then traced the angry, knotted scar tissue on his shoulder, the mark of a musket ball meant for his heart. He tried to pull away, to spare her the ugliness of his survival, but she held him fast. "You are not wreckage," she whispered, her fingers moving from his shoulder to cup the ruined side of his face. He leaned into her touch, a starving man presented with bread, his resistance crumbling. "You are Julian. The war took your peace, and your father took our years. But I will not let the darkness take you now." For the first time since their reunion, the immortal Major wept, burying his face in the lap of the wife he had tried so hard to die for, while she stroked his hair and anchored him back to the living world. The morning sun had barely crested the hills when the rumble of a coach and four announced an arrival that chilled the air of the estate more effectively than the winter frost. Julian stood in the entrance hall, leaning heavily on his cane, as the heavy oak doors were thrown open. His father, the Duke of Stirling, swept in with the arrogance of a man who believed the world existed solely to pave his path. He was immaculate in velvet and lace, a stark contrast to Julian's simple, unadorned attire. "So the rumours are true," the Duke sneered, peeling off his gloves with slow deliberation. "You have retrieved your little stray from the gutter. I had hoped the war would have cured you of such sentimental weakness, Julian." Julian's grip on his cane tightened until the wood creaked. "You mean the wife you told me had abandoned me? The woman you told her was a widow?" The Duke laughed, a dry, joyless sound. He strolled past Julian, inspecting the dust on a side table with disdain. "Oh, spare me the melodrama. I did what was necessary to secure our future," the Duke said, his voice devoid of apology. "The Stirling coffers were empty, Julian. I needed a hero son to marry the Winthrop heiress, not a boy pining for a pauper. If you had died a hero, the pension would have saved us. If you returned a widower, the heiress would have saved us." He adjusted his cuffs, looking at his son with cold calculation. "Evelyn was simply an obstacle to the solvency of this family. I removed her from the board. It was a business decision, nothing more." "There was no allowance," Julian said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Of course she says that," the Duke countered smoothly, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She is a gold-digger, boy. She saw you survive and realised the fortune was back within reach. Why else would she be found in squalor, to manipulate your guilt? You are a soldier. Surely you recognise a tactical feint when you see one." For 3 years Julian had sought death as a release from pain. He had looked into the abyss and wished to fall. But as he looked at his father, this immaculate, poisonous man who spoke of destroying lives as if it were estate management, Julian felt something stir in his chest that was not despair. It was fire. For the first time since Spain, he did not want to die. He wanted to destroy the threat standing in his hallway. "Get out," Julian said. The words were not shouted, but they carried the weight of a command given under fire. The Duke blinked, taken aback. "I beg your pardon?" "You heard me." Julian stepped forward, abandoning the support of his cane to stand tall, the pain in his leg ignored, his eyes, cold and lethal, locked onto his father's. "You speak of my wife again, and I will forget that we share blood. I survived the French artillery, father. Do not think you are more dangerous than they were." The Duke stiffened, seeing for the first time that the son he had sent away a boy had returned a man capable of terrible violence. He sneered, turning on his heel. "You choose a peasant over your birthright? You will regret this folly, Julian." "The only regret," Julian called after him as the doors swung shut, "is that I did not return sooner to protect her from you." The confrontation with his father had shifted something fundamental in Julian. He realised that simply housing Evelyn was not enough. He had to win her back. He had to rebuild the bridge he had burned with his anger and silence. The next morning, Evelyn descended to the breakfast room to find Julian waiting, but the immortal Major was gone. In his place stood a man dressed in a soft linen shirt and a coat of deep blue wool, civilian colours. The stiff red uniform that had been his armour against the world had been packed away. He looked less like a weapon and more like the husband she remembered, though the jagged scar remained a testament to the years lost. "I realised," he said, gesturing awkwardly to a chair, "that I have spent 3 years marching away from you. I should like to start walking back." Beside her plate sat a small velvet-wrapped parcel. Evelyn hesitated, expecting money or perhaps the keys to the household, practical things. Instead, she unwrapped a comb made of tortoiseshell inlaid with mother-of-pearl in the shape of ivy leaves. It was not a necessity for a former laundress. It was a trinket for a beloved woman. "Ivy," he murmured, watching her face with an intensity that made her flush. "Because it survives the harshest winters and still grows green, like you." In the weeks that followed, the silent, cavernous estate began to fill with the quiet sounds of courtship. Julian ceased retreating to the library to brood over brandy. Instead, he joined her in the gardens, limping beside her as she pruned the roses that had grown wild in his absence. He brought her books of poetry, stumbling over the verses as he read aloud, his voice rough but earnest, trying to, recapture the cadence of their youth. But the true intimacy came not with gifts, but with words. One rainy afternoon, as they sat by the fire, Julian finally spoke of Spain. He did not speak of glory or strategy, but of the smell of the dust, the taste of fear, and the letters he had written her in his head while waiting for the order to charge. "I thought of you at Salamanca," he confessed, staring into the flames. "The smoke was so thick I couldn't see my own hand. I was certain I would die, and my only terror was not the pain, but the thought that I would fade from your memory." He looked at her then, his eyes stripped of their defences. "I told myself I hated you to survive the pain of losing you, but I never stopped looking for your face in the smoke." Evelyn reached out, taking his scarred hand in hers. She did not offer platitudes or pity. She simply held him, anchoring him to the present, accepting the weight of his memories as shared cargo. In that quiet exchange, the ghosts of the war began to recede, chased away by the fragile, growing light of a second chance. The invitation to the grand victory ball at Almack's could not be refused. It was the most exclusive event of the season, presided over by the ruthless patronesses of London society, and to decline would be to admit defeat to the gossips who were already feasting on the rumours of Julian's slum wife. Evelyn stood before the mirror, her hands trembling as she smoothed the emerald silk of her gown, a colour Julian had chosen because it matched her eyes. She felt like an impostor, a washerwoman wrapped in a lady's skin. "You are the most beautiful woman in London," Julian said from the doorway, sensing her fear. He offered his arm, his expression fierce and protective. "And tonight they will know it." But the ballroom was a battlefield of a different sort. As they entered, the music didn't stop, but the conversation did. A ripple of whispers followed them like a wake. Julian was greeted with bows and averted eyes, respect tinged with fear of the immortal Major. Evelyn, however, was met with the sharp, cutting glances of the ton. Julian was pulled away briefly by a general wishing to discuss tactics, leaving Evelyn stranded near the refreshment table. Immediately the wolves descended. Lady Jersey and her circle closed in, their fans snapping like trapjaws. "My dear," Lady Jersey purred, her voice loud enough to carry, "is it true you were taking in washing in Whitechapel? How quaint. I suppose one must have strong hands to scrub the filth from other people's linens. Do be careful with that crystal glass. We wouldn't want you to think you need to wash it." The surrounding ladies tittered behind their hands. Evelyn flushed crimson, her throat tightening. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but years of poverty had taught her to shrink from power, not challenge it. Suddenly the air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The laughter died instantly. Julian had returned. He did not shout. He did not cause a scene. He simply walked through the crowd, his cane thumping rhythmically against the floor, a predator moving through a herd of sheep. He stopped beside Evelyn, looming over the group of women. He looked at Lady Jersey with the same cold, dead eyes that had stared down French cavalry charges. "Lady Jersey," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the silent room. "My wife's hands may be rough from labour, but that is because she possesses a strength of character that you, in your silk and idleness, could not begin to fathom. She survived a hell that would have broken you in a day." He slowly scanned the room, meeting the gaze of every man and woman who had sneered. "I have killed men for less disrespect than you have shown her tonight. If anyone here finds her company beneath them, they may leave, or they may answer to me." No one moved. No one breathed. Julian turned to Evelyn, his expression softening instantly as if they were the only two people in the world. He bowed low, offering his hand. "My love, I believe they are playing a waltz. Will you do me the honour?" As he led her onto the floor, the terrified society parted like the Red Sea, and for the first time, Evelyn held her head high, guarded by the most dangerous man in England. The summons to the Stirling townhouse came the morning after the ball. It was not a request, it was an ultimatum. Julian walked into his father's study with Evelyn's hand firmly in his, ignoring the Duke's command to leave the woman outside. The Duke stood by the fireplace, his face purple with a rage that had been simmering since the reports of the waltz had reached him. "You have made a mockery of this family," the Duke roared, slamming his hand onto the mantel. "Parading that laundress before the peerage, threatening Lady Jersey. Have you lost your mind along with your looks?" "I have found my spine, father," Julian replied calmly, his grip on Evelyn's hand unyielding. "Something I sadly did not inherit from you." The Duke's eyes narrowed to slits. He moved to his desk and picked up a heavy parchment document. "This is the deed of entailment. If you do not annul this marriage immediately, if you do not cast her out and marry a woman of suitable breeding, I will cut you off. You will lose the allowance, the estate in Kent, the title, everything. You will be a pauper, Julian, a cripple with nothing but a washerwoman to support him." The room held its breath. Evelyn squeezed Julian's hand, her eyes wide with fear. She knew what the title meant to men of his station. It was their identity, their history, their very soul. To lose it was to become nothing. She opened her mouth to tell him to choose the dukedom, that she would understand, but Julian squeezed back, silencing her. He looked at the deed, then at his father's contorted face. And then Julian Stirling did something he had not done in years. He threw back his head and laughed. It was a free, genuine sound that bounced off the mahogany walls, startling the Duke into silence. "You think you can threaten me with poverty?" Julian asked, shaking his head with amusement. "Father, I have eaten rats in the peninsula. I have slept in mud while cannon fire shook the earth. I have walked through the valley of the shadow of death so many times I know the terrain by heart." He stepped forward, releasing Evelyn only to place his hands on the desk and lean in close. "You think your money defines me? I survived because of her. When I thought she betrayed me, I wanted to die. Now that I know she is true, I would live in a ditch with her before I spent another night under a roof paid for by your lies." Julian straightened, pulling his signet ring, the crest of the Stirling heirs, from his finger. He tossed it onto the desk, where it spun and clattered to a stop. "Keep the title, keep the money, keep your hollow, miserable legacy. I have the only thing in this room of any value." He turned to Evelyn, his face radiant with a lightness she had never seen. "Come, my love, let us leave this tomb." And without looking back at the sputtering Duke or the fortune he had just discarded, Julian walked out into the sunlight, a man finally, truly free. They found a cottage in the Cotswolds, far from the smog of London and the poison of the Stirling estate. It was modest, with a thatched roof that leaked in heavy rain, and a garden that required their own hands to tend, but to Julian it was a palace. For the first time, the silence of the countryside did not feel empty. It felt like peace. Yet the scars of war did not vanish simply because he had chosen love. One evening, a summer thunderstorm rolled in, shaking the cottage with cracks of thunder that sounded too much like artillery. Julian was found huddled in the corner of the kitchen, his hands pressed over his ears, his breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. The immortal Major was gone, replaced by a trembling man lost in the memories of Vittoria. Evelyn did not coddle him, nor did she look away in shame. She sat on the floor beside him, her presence solid and warm against his shivering side. "Listen to me," she said, her voice steady beneath the roar of the storm. "That is not cannon fire. It is just the rain feeding our garden. You are here. You are with me." She took his hands from his ears and placed them on her rounded belly, where life was kicking against his palm. "Feel that? That is the future, Julian. The past cannot touch us here." Slowly the terror receded from his eyes, replaced by wonder as he felt the strong rhythmic movement of their child. He leaned his forehead against hers, breathing in her scent until his heart matched the steady beat of the rain. Months later, the cottage was filled with a new sound, the cry of a newborn. Julian sat in the rocking chair by the fire, holding his son with a reverence he had never shown a weapon. The baby was tiny, fragile, yet his grip on Julian's finger was surprisingly strong. He looked down at the child's sleeping face, then at Evelyn, who dozed on the sofa nearby, exhaustion and joy mingling on her features. He traced the curve of his son's cheek, marvelling at the perfection of it. He thought of the suicide missions, the desperate charges, the nights he had prayed for a French bullet to end his misery. How close he had come to missing this. How easily he could have been a name on a memorial stone, cold and forgotten, instead of a father holding a warm, breathing miracle. "I volunteered for death," he whispered to the sleeping infant, a confession made to the quiet room. "I chased it across a continent because I thought I had nothing left to lose." He kissed the top of his son's head, tears pricking his eyes, not of grief, but of profound gratitude. "But living, staying here, building this, loving your mother," he looked at Evelyn, his heart swelling until it felt too big for his chest. "This is the bravest thing I have ever done, and it is the only mission that ever truly mattered." The end of one journey is simply the beginning of the next. A new story is waiting for you on the screen right now. Click it to discover another world of passion, heart, and unforgettable courage.